A humble housekeeper leaves her home to work in a mansion belonging to a traditional family. Over time, a unique bond forms with the family's matriarch, but the arrival of a manipulative woman endangers the stability and affection of their home. This story narrates the struggle to preserve love, loyalty, and justice amidst a web of deceit and betrayal. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching us from. We'll continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll ever hear. The bus rattled for the last time, before stopping at the Bath bus station. Mary Ann stepped off, holding only an old fabric suitcase and a bag with a few belongings. Her brown eyes observed the regal town with a mixture of awe and anxiety. She had never seen such grand buildings, such clean streets, such gleaming cars. She came from a remote village in the Scottish Highlands, where the houses were simple, the roads unpaved, and dreams too small to fit into the heart of a 22-year-old woman. The employment agency had secured the position for her, a housekeeper in a traditional family's mansion, fair salary, regular days off, her own room. For Mary Ann, who was leaving behind a sick mother, 2 younger siblings, and a father who worked from dawn till dusk on the farm without being able to pay the bills, this opportunity was a miracle. She would send money every month. She would help her family from afar, just as so many other women from her homeland did. The taxi drove up Pulteney Street, passing old stately homes and blooming gardens, until it stopped before an ornate iron gate. Through the bars, Mary Ann glimpsed the mansion, 3 stories, white walls, enormous, windows with blue shutters, a garden filled with rose bushes that looked as if they had been planted decades ago. She swallowed hard. It was larger than the entire church in her village. An older staff member opened the gate and greeted her with a tired smile. She introduced herself as Cindy, the cook who had been there for 15 years. She led Mary Ann through the spacious corridors, past crystal chandeliers and ancient paintings hanging on the walls, to a small but cozy room at the back of the house. It was simple, clean, with a window overlooking the garden. Mary Ann placed her suitcase on the bed and felt her eyes well up. She had never had a room all to herself. Cindy explained the routine. Wake up at 6, prepare Mrs. Helen's breakfast, help with household chores, serve meals, take care of the laundry. The mistress of the house was Mrs. Helen, a 73-year-old lady, widowed for 5 years, mother of an only son named Richard. He was a businessman, traveled a lot, and was almost never home. Mrs. Helen lived practically alone in that immensity of rooms and memories. At their first meeting, Mary Ann felt her heart tighten. Mrs. Helen was sitting in the living room armchair, a shawl draped over her shoulders, looking out the window at the garden. She had white hair pulled back in an elegant bun, wrinkles that etched a lifetime onto her face, and blue eyes that still shone with vivacity. When she saw Mary Ann, she smiled with unexpected sweetness. "Welcome, my dear. What's your name?" "Mary Ann, madam. It's an honor to be here." "The honor is mine, dear. It's been a long time since I've seen a new face around here. Please sit down. You don't need to stand in front of me as if you were a stranger." That simple gesture untangled something within Mary Ann. In previous jobs, she had always been treated with indifference, sometimes with disdain. Here, on that first afternoon, Mrs. Helen asked about her family, about her homeland, about her dreams. She listened to every word with genuine attention, as if it truly mattered. When Mary Ann mentioned her sick mother, the lady held her hand and said she would pray for her every night. The first few days were for adaptation. Mary Ann learned to prepare the herbal tea that Mrs. Helen liked to drink in the late afternoon, discovered that the lady preferred lighter meals, and memorized the location of every object in the immense house. But what impressed her most was the solitude that permeated those corridors. Mrs. Helen spent hours in the garden talking to the rose bushes her late husband had planted. Sometimes she would stand before old photographs, touching the glass of the frames, as if she could cross through time. One afternoon, while serving tea, Mary Ann dared to ask about the flowers. Mrs. Helen smiled sadly. "My Anthony loved roses. He used to say they were the only flowers worthy of a queen. He planted each one of these with his own hands. When he passed, I thought about tearing them all out, because it hurt too much to look at them. But then I realized That would be erasing his presence from this house. So I cared for each rose as if I were caring for the memory of our love. Mary Ann felt a lump in her throat. There was so much feeling in those words, so much devotion. At that moment, she decided she would do more than just work in that house. She would care for that woman who deserved so much more than the loneliness life had imposed on her. Weeks turned into months. The routine took on contours of affection. Mrs. Helen insisted that Mary Ann have lunch and dinner with her, saying it made no sense to eat alone at such a large table. They talked about everything. The lady told stories from when she was young, of the balls she attended, of the day she met Anthony, of the joy of seeing Richard born. Mary Ann spoke of her childhood in the countryside, of playing in the river, of church festivals, of the dreams she still harbored of one day owning her own home for her family. Over time, they realized that their coexistence had transformed into something much deeper than a working relationship. Mary Ann found herself worried when Mrs. Helen coughed at night, rushing to cover her better, preparing warm soups without being asked. The lady, in turn, saved the best fruits for Mary Ann, bought creams for her hands, which were always chapped from work, and asked every day if she had sent money to her mother. Richard appeared from time to time. He was a tall man, about 40 years old, always wearing impeccable suits and carrying a leather briefcase. He treated his mother with affection, but it was clear he was immersed in the world of business. He greeted Mary Ann politely, thanked her for taking care of Mrs. Helen, and returned to his meetings and travels. He wasn't malicious, just absent. Modern life had transformed him into someone always too busy to notice what truly mattered. One night, Mrs. Helen had a severe coughing fit. Mary Ann woke up to the noise, rushed to the lady's room and found her sitting on the bed, pale, struggling to breathe. She immediately called Richard, who arranged for them to go to the hospital. They stayed there until dawn. It was just a respiratory infection, nothing serious, but the scare was significant. On the way home, Richard held Mary Ann's arm and said sincerely, "Thank you for taking care of my mother, as if she were your own family. I know she's not easy sometimes, stubborn as she is, but you have a patience I no longer possess." "She's not stubborn, Mr. Richard. She's lonely. And loneliness hurts more than any illness." Richard fell silent, as if those words had opened a wound he preferred to keep closed. He nodded and left the next morning for another business trip. Mrs. Helen recovered quickly, but something had changed. She began to call Mary Ann "my dear" more often, asked her to sleep in the next room in case she needed anything during the night, and included her in all household decisions. One afternoon, while they were watering the rose bushes together, Mrs. Helen paused and looked at Mary Ann with those blue eyes full of tenderness. "You know, my dear, I prayed a lot after Anthony passed. I asked God not to let me die of loneliness in this huge house, and then you arrived. I don't believe in coincidences. I believe you were sent to me." Mary Ann embraced the lady, feeling tears stream down her face. She also didn't believe in coincidences. She had left her homeland in search of work, but had found something much greater. She had found a home. She had found a family that blood hadn't given, but her heart had chosen. The days continued peacefully, until one afternoon Richard arrived accompanied. He wore a different smile on his lips, the kind of expression men usually have when they are smitten by someone. Beside him, a woman entered the room, making Mary Ann feel an involuntary shiver. She was beautiful, elegant, dressed in expensive clothes and carrying a designer bag. Dark hair, perfectly brushed, manicured nails, impeccable makeup. But there was something in her eyes that didn't match her rehearsed smile. Something cold, calculating, dangerous. "Mother Mary Ann, I want to introduce Veronica. We've been seeing each other for a few months." Veronica extended her hand to Mrs. Helen with a gesture that seemed more formal than genuine. Her gaze swept around the room as if evaluating merchandise. Mary Ann noticed the way she wrinkled her nose at the sight of the antique furniture, how her eyes fixed on the paintings with an expression of disapproval. "Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Helen. Richard talks so much about you." Her voice was too sweet, artificial. Mary Ann knew that kind of falsity. She had seen women like that in her village, those who smiled to your face and stabbed you in the back. She greeted Veronica politely but kept her distance. Something about that woman wasn't right, and her instinct never deceived her. Mrs. Helen, always gracious, invited Veronica for tea. Throughout the conversation, the visitor made subtle comments about the need to modernize the decor, about how old houses required a lot of maintenance, about how much more practical it would be to live in a modern apartment. Richard listened to everything with a foolish smile, clearly enchanted. Mrs. Helen responded with patience, but Mary Ann saw the sadness growing in her eyes. When Veronica left, the lady remained silent for a long time. The following weeks brought a noticeable change in the mansion's atmosphere. Veronica began to appear with increasing frequency. First they were sporadic weekend visits, then weeknight dinners, until she started acting as if the house were already hers. She arrived unannounced, brought decoration magazines, pointed to the antique furniture, and sighed as if she were facing deplorable objects that needed urgent disposal. Mary Ann observed everything with growing concern. She noticed how Veronica never looked directly at Mrs. Helen when she spoke, how she avoided touching any object in the house with expressed repulsion, how her smile disappeared the exact moment Richard left the room. But what bothered her most was the way she had started making seemingly innocent comments that, in reality, carried pure venom. During lunch, Veronica looked at the meat dish prepared by Mary Ann, according to Mrs. Helen's traditional recipe, and commented with false concern. "My goodness, Richard, this has so much salt. Mrs. Helen, shouldn't you be controlling your diet better? At your age, sodium can be dangerous for the heart. I have an excellent nutritionist who could create a more suitable menu for the elderly." Mrs. Helen lowered her eyes, suddenly insecure about something she had always done with mastery. Mary Ann felt rage boil within her, but she maintained her composure. Richard, distracted as ever, merely nodded, agreeing without thinking about the consequences of those words. The next day, Veronica brought pre-made meals from a healthy food company, tasteless food, without seasoning, without soul. Mrs. Helen ate in silence, but Mary Ann saw the contained tears in the lady's eyes when she looked at the kitchen where so many recipes had been prepared with love over the years. The attacks continued, always disguised as care. Veronica commented on Mrs. Helen's clothes, suggesting they were too old-fashioned, that they made her look even older. She brought catalogues from modern stores, pointed to dresses that had nothing to do with the lady's elegant and classic style. She questioned Mrs. Helen's routine, saying that spending so much time in the garden wasn't healthy, that the strong sun could cause problems for an elderly person's delicate skin. Each comment was like a small prick. Individually, they might seem like genuine concern, but cumulatively, day after day, they formed a cruel pattern of systematic devaluation. Mary Ann tried to talk to Richard, but he was completely blinded by enchantment. He thought Veronica was attentive, modern, concerned about his mother's well-being. One afternoon, while Mary Ann was helping Mrs. Helen water the rose bushes, the lady stopped and held the watering can with trembling hands. "Mary Ann, do you think I'm getting too old? Am I really behind the times, as Veronica says?" The young woman dropped what she was doing and held the lady's hands firmly. "Mrs. Helen, you are the most elegant and wise woman I have ever known. Don't let anyone make you doubt who you are. These roses here are proof that you have cared for things with love and dedication for years. That's not being behind the times, that's having roots." The lady smiled, but Mary Ann saw that the seed of doubt had already been planted, and Veronica was an expert at watering those seeds until they grew into trees of insecurity. Veronica's visits became even more frequent. She started arriving in the morning, staying all day and only leaving at night. She walked around the house as if she were taking a mental inventory of everything that needed to be changed. Mary Ann caught her several times taking photos of the rooms, writing things in a small notebook, measuring spaces with a tape measure she carried in her bag. When questioned, she responded with that fake smile that Richard found charming. "I'm just thinking about how to make this place more comfortable for Mrs. Helen. Such a large house requires a lot of maintenance. Perhaps a renovation would help." But Mrs. Helen didn't want a renovation. That house was the last living piece of her history with Anthony. Every piece of furniture had been chosen by them together. Every painting held a memory. Every room preserved conversations, laughter, tears shared over decades. Destroying that would be like erasing her very existence. One night, Mary Ann heard raised voices coming from the living room. She approached carefully and listened to Veronica talking on the phone. Her voice had lost all artificial sweetness. "No, not yet, but I'm working on it. The old woman is still too lucid, but I'll undermine her little by little. Richard is already convinced she needs more care. It's only a matter of time until he agrees to the transfer. And when that happens, I'll have control over everything. This house is worth a fortune, and the company shares in her name. Well, don't even get me started. I just need to be patient and continue playing my role as the concerned one." Mary Ann felt her blood run cold. She needed to do something, but she knew that without proof, no one would believe her. A simple housekeeper against a sophisticated woman who had completely won over the mistress's son. It would be her word against Veronica's, and in such a confrontation, she would always lose. It was then that Mary Ann began to record conversations. She used the old cell phone she had bought with her first salary, hiding it in strategic places around the house when Veronica arrived. The first recording was precisely that phone conversation. Then others followed. Veronica commenting to a friend about how disgusted she was to have to feign sympathy for the old woman who lived in the past. Veronica laughing at the house's decor, saying that as soon as she had control over everything, she would rip out those hideous roses from the garden and build a modern deck. Veronica planning how she would convince Richard to admit his mother to a care home. Each recording was a stab to Mary Ann's heart. How could someone be so cruel? How could she destroy the life of an innocent person merely out of greed? Veronica's strategy intensified when she brought a doctor to the mansion. She introduced him as a renowned geriatric specialist, someone who could perform a complete assessment of Mrs. Helen's health. Richard, always trusting Veronica, thought the idea was excellent. They scheduled the consultation for an afternoon when Mary Ann would be shopping, but the young woman grew suspicious and decided to return early. She hid in the corridor and watched the entire scene. The supposed doctor asked tricky questions formulated to confuse anyone. He asked Mrs. Helen to repeat impossible number sequences, name objects he hadn't even properly shown, and recall events he invented on the spot. When the lady naturally became confused, he noted everything in a notebook with a grave expression, shaking his head negatively. At the end, he called Richard and Veronica for a private conversation. Mary Ann managed to get close to the half-open door and hear every word of that absurd farce. "I regret to inform you, but Mrs. Helen shows clear signs of advanced cognitive deterioration. Her memory is compromised, as is her judgment. In my professional opinion, she should not continue living alone. She poses a risk to herself and others. I strongly recommend admission to a specialized care home where she will receive appropriate care." Richard turned pale. Veronica placed a hand on his shoulder, feigning sadness, but Mary Ann saw the glint of satisfaction in her eyes. It was all a lie. Mrs. Helen was perfectly lucid, just a little forgetful like anyone her age. But that fake doctor had painted a picture of a severe illness that didn't exist. Mary Ann wanted to scream, wanted to enter the room and expose the whole farce. But she knew she would be immediately expelled. She needed more proof, more recordings. She needed to build an irrefutable case before acting. So she remained hidden, recording every word of that fraudulent consultation, feeling rage and helplessness burn in her chest. That night, Mrs. Helen was devastated. Richard had told her about the diagnosis, and although he tried to be delicate, the lady perceived the gravity of the situation. She sat in the armchair where she always stayed, looking at the garden through the window, and tears silently streamed down her wrinkled face. "Mary Ann, am I really losing my mind? Sometimes I forget where. I put my glasses, or I repeat a story I've already told. Am I sick and don't realize it?" The young woman knelt beside the armchair and held the lady's hands with all the tenderness she could muster. "Mrs. Helen, everyone forgets things. I myself forget where I left my keys at least 3 times a week. That doesn't mean we're sick. You are perfectly fine, I swear. Don't believe those stories." But the damage was already done. Veronica had managed to plant the seed of doubt, not only in Richard but in Mrs. Helen herself. The lady began to question every lapse of memory, every small oversight, every word that escaped her. She started to isolate herself more, to speak less, afraid of saying something wrong that would confirm the supposed diagnosis. Mary Ann needed to act fast. She continued recording all suspicious conversations, all malicious comments, all the lies Veronica told Richard about alleged episodes of Mrs. Helen's confusion that had never happened. Her phone was full of evidence, but she knew she needed to wait for the right moment to reveal everything. The days that followed were marked by a growing tension that hung over the mansion, like a dark cloud. Veronica had realized that her strategy was working and decided to tighten the noose even further. She started sleeping at the house several nights a week, occupying the guest room as if she already owned the place. In the morning, she would come down for breakfast with a proprietorial demeanor, giving Mary Ann orders on how to prepare things, reorganizing cupboards, changing small details of the decor without asking anyone's permission. Mrs. Helen was becoming a shadow of her former self. The vibrant woman Mary Ann had known on the first day had given way to someone fragile, insecure, constantly questioning every action she took. She stopped going to the garden with the same frequency, afraid that the sun would harm her, as Veronica insisted. She stopped suggesting the dishes she liked to eat, passively accepting the tasteless pre-made meals that kept arriving. Even her posture changed, as if she wanted to occupy less space in the world, to gradually disappear so as not to bother anyone. Richard travelled more and more. His business required constant presence in London and Edinburgh, and Veronica always found perfect excuses for him to leave peacefully. She said she would take care of everything, that his mother was in good hands, that he didn't need to worry. And Richard, naive and smitten, believed every word. One morning, Mary Ann found Mrs. Helen sitting on the edge of the bed, still in her nightgown, staring into space. She approached carefully and saw that the lady was holding an old photograph. It was from her wedding day with Anthony, both young, radiant, looking at each other as if they were the only people in the universe. "You know, Mary Ann, when this photo was taken, I was sure I would live a happy life. And I did. But now I wonder if I'm not just a burden to everyone. If it wouldn't be better for me to be in one of those places Veronica mentions, where I wouldn't bother anyone." The young woman sat beside the lady and hugged her tightly. "You've never been a burden. You never will be. This house is yours, this life is yours. Don't let them take that from you." But words of comfort no longer seemed to reach Mrs. Helen. The erosion caused by Veronica's constant comments had been too deep. The lady truly believed she was becoming a burden, that her presence was inconvenient, that it would be better for everyone if she simply disappeared from that house full of memories. That same week, Veronica escalated her campaign to a new level. She began inviting friends to visit the mansion, always in Richard's presence. They showed the rooms, commented on the property's potential, openly discussed renovations, as if Mrs. Helen wasn't even there. During one of these visits, Mary Ann overheard a conversation that made her blood boil. "Veronica, are you sure you'll be able to get the old woman out of here? Because this house is a dream. The location, don't even get me started. If well renovated, it should easily be worth about $5 million. Veronica responded with that calculating smile Mary Ann had learned to hate. "It's a matter of time, dear. Richard is already convinced she needs special care. I'm finalizing the details with a luxury care home nearby. As soon as he travels next week, I'll speed up the process. She'll go there and presto, problem solved." "And the company shares? I heard most of them are still in her name. I've already arranged the necessary documents. I have a lawyer who will take care of everything. A power of attorney here, a signature there, and it's done. The old woman won't even understand what she signed." Mary Ann had to restrain herself from entering the room and confronting that viper. But she remained calm, recorded everything, and waited. She knew the moment to act was approaching. She just needed a few more pieces of evidence, something absolutely irrefutable. The opportunity came when Veronica received a visit from the lawyer. Mary Ann pretended to be busy cleaning the corridor while the two talked in the living room. She left her cell phone recording hidden behind a flower vase. The conversation was revealing. "The documents are ready. There are 3 powers of attorney that grant full control over the shares, bank accounts, and property sales. I managed to perfectly imitate her signature. No one will question it. Veronica flipped through the papers with visible satisfaction. Perfect. And has Richard signed the authorization for admission? Not yet, but it won't be a problem. I'll use his stamp from the office drawer. He never checks these things anyway. By the time he realizes, his mother will already be admitted, and it will be too late to turn back. What if she refuses to go? That's what the nurses I hired her for. They have experience dealing with resistant elderly people. They'll convince her one way or another. The lawyer laughed, a sound that made Mary Ann feel nauseous. You've thought of everything. When this happens, I want my fees paid on time. Don't worry. As soon as I have access to her accounts, you'll get what we agreed on. Mary Ann left there trembling with rage and fear. That wasn't just psychological manipulation. It was theft, document forgery, forced admission. It was the complete destruction of Mrs. Helen's life, and it had to be stopped at all costs. That night she tried again to talk to Richard, but he was euphoric about a new contract he had closed and barely paid attention to what she was saying. When Mary Ann mentioned her concerns about Veronica, he simply smiled and said she was exaggerating, that Veronica was wonderful and only wanted the best for his mother. Mary Ann realized she was alone in that battle. She couldn't count on Richard, at least not yet. She needed such compelling evidence that he would have no choice but to see the truth, and she would get that evidence even if it was the last thing she ever did. In the following days, she intensified her surveillance. She recorded Veronica talking on the phone with the director of the luxury care home, confirming the spot for Mrs. Helen and saying the transfer would be made next week. She recorded another conversation with the fake doctor, where he asked for more money to keep silent about the fabricated report. She recorded Veronica instructing the nurses on how to proceed if Mrs. Helen resisted, telling them to sedate her, if necessary. Each recording was a piece of the macabre puzzle Veronica had assembled, and Mary Ann was putting them all together, organizing them chronologically, creating a complete dossier of the entire farce. Mrs. Helen, meanwhile, had practically given up fighting. She passively accepted when Veronica began packing some of her belongings, saying it was just to better organize the wardrobe. She didn't question when catalogues of care homes for the elderly began appearing on the living room table. She seemed to have resigned herself to the fate others were charting for her. One afternoon, while Mary Ann was helping Mrs. Helen get dressed, she saw the extent of the emotional damage. The lady was so thin that her clothes seemed to hang off her body. She had deep, dark circles under her eyes, as if she hadn't slept for days. Her hands trembled constantly, not from illness, but from pure anxiety. Mrs. Helen, please don't give up. I know things are difficult, but it will pass. I promise it will pass. The lady looked at Mary Ann with tired, dull eyes. My dear, you are young and have your whole life ahead of you. I have already lived what I had to live. If I am to leave this house, then so be it. I no longer have the strength to fight against the inevitable. Those words broke Mary Ann's heart. To see such a strong, vibrant woman reduced to that state of resignation was too painful. But it also served as fuel for her determination. She would not let Veronica win. She would not let Mrs. Helen be torn from her home, her memories, her dignity. Richard announced that he would be travelling to London on Monday and would be away all week. He had important meetings he couldn't postpone. Veronica immediately offered to stay and take care of Mrs. Helen, and he accepted with gratitude. He didn't suspect that he was handing his mother over to someone who planned to destroy her. On the eve of the trip, Mary Ann witnessed a scene that almost made her lose her composure. Veronica was in the garden with 2 women, showing the rose bushes and explaining how she intended to rip everything out to create a modern living space. She spoke of the flowers with contempt, as if they were just old ugly plants that needed to be eliminated. These roses are hideous. They take up too much space and require constant maintenance. I'm going to put in artificial grass, some palm trees, build a deck with a barbecue. It will be much more beautiful and practical. One of the women asked about Mrs. Helen, and Veronica replied coldly, "Oh, she won't be here to see it. On Monday, I'll resolve this matter once and for all." Mary Ann recorded everything. Every word, every cruel laugh, every malicious plan. Her phone was full of evidence, but she knew the crucial moment was yet to come. When Richard left, Veronica would act. And it would be precisely then that Mary Ann would need to be ready to act too. Monday dawned grey over Bath. Heavy clouds covered the sky, as if nature itself sensed that something terrible was about to happen. Richard left early while it was still dark to catch his flight to London. He kissed his mother's forehead, who was still asleep, and departed without imagining that he was leaving Mrs. Helen at the mercy of a predator who had everything calculated. Veronica arrived at the mansion even before the sun had fully risen. She carried a different energy, an ill-disguised excitement of someone who would finally see her plans materialize. She didn't even wait for Mary Ann to prepare breakfast. She went straight to the office and started making calls. "I confirm for today at 2 in the afternoon. Yes, she is ready. No, there will be no resistance. My men will ensure everything goes smoothly. Bring all the paperwork I need to sign." Mary Ann heard everything from the corridor. Her heart raced. So it was today. Veronica had chosen the first day of Richard's trip to execute her plan. She wouldn't waste time. She wanted Mrs. Helen out of the house before there was any chance of anyone intervening. During the morning, strange things began to arrive. First, empty cardboard boxes, brought by a moving truck. Then, uniformed men arrived, introducing themselves as being from a specialized transport company. They brought stretchers, medical equipment, documents in folders. Veronica received them with familiarity, giving instructions on what to pack, what to leave, how to proceed if the lady refused to cooperate. Mrs. Helen watched everything from her armchair in the living room, paralyzed. She didn't cry, she didn't scream. She just looked with that devastating resignation of someone who no longer believes they have a voice or value. Mary Ann approached her and held her hand tightly. "Mrs. Helen, do you trust me?" The lady looked at her with tired eyes and nodded. "Yes." "Then promise me you'll hold on just a little longer. I'm going to fix this, I promise." But even as she spoke, Mary Ann felt fear tighten her chest. What if she couldn't? What if Richard didn't answer the phone? What if the evidence she had wasn't enough? So many doubts, but there was no time to hesitate. She had to act. She went to her room and picked up her phone. She called Richard, but it went to voicemail. She tried again. Nothing. She sent urgent messages, asking him to answer, saying it was an emergency, but no response came. He must have been in a meeting, with his phone off or on silent mode. Despair began to take over. It was almost noon, and Veronica had said everything would happen at 2 in the afternoon. Only 2 hours remained. Mary Ann tried to call Richard's secretary, his office, anyone who could locate him. Nothing worked. It was as if the universe was conspiring against her. She returned to the living room and found Veronica instructing the men on how to pack Mrs. Helen's personal belongings. The woman held a list and checked off items, deciding what would go to the care home and what would stay. She had even set aside some jewelry, saying it was too dangerous for someone with cognitive problems to access. Mrs. Helen remained seated, motionless, watching her life being packed into boxes as if it were worthless merchandise. Mary Ann felt tears burn in her eyes, but she couldn't afford to break down. She needed to keep a clear head, think of a solution. It was then that a desperate idea emerged. Richard was staying at a hotel in London. She didn't know exactly which one, but she knew he always stayed in the Oxford Street area. There were only a few top-tier hotels there. She could call each one until she found him. She locked herself in her room and began a frantic search. She called the first hotel on the list. No Richard staying there. Second hotel, same answer. Third, fourth, fifth, nothing. Her voice grew increasingly shaky, more desperate, until at the 6th hotel the receptionist confirmed, "Yes, we have a Richard Alistair staying here. I'll transfer you to his room." The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. No one answered. Mary Ann almost hung up when she finally heard his voice on the other side. "Hello? Mr. Richard, thank goodness. Please, I need you to listen to me. Your mother is in danger." "Mary Ann, what's going on?" "I'm in an important meeting. Can it wait?" "It cannot wait." Veronica is right now preparing everything to take Mrs. Helen to a care home. She hired men, brought boxes, an ambulance is arriving at 2 in the afternoon, and it doesn't stop there. I have proof that everything was planned. The medical diagnosis was false, the documents were forged. She wants to steal your mother's shares and money. I recorded everything, Mr. Richard. All the conversations, all the plans. Please, you need to come back now. On the other end of the line, silence. Mary Ann could hear Richard's heavy breathing, processing everything he had just heard. Are you absolutely sure of what you're saying, Mary Ann? I have all the proof, Mr. Richard. Recordings of conversations, plans, everything. Veronica is not who you think she is. She only wants your mother's money and assets, and she will get them if you don't come back now. Another silence, longer. Then Richard's voice, now firm and determined. Don't let anyone take my mother from home. Do whatever it takes to stop them. I'm leaving the hotel now, going straight to the airport. I can get a flight to Edinburgh in an hour. From there, I'll take a car and arrive in Bath in 3 hours at most. Hold the situation until I get there. I'll try, Mr. Richard. Please, come quickly. She hung up the phone with trembling hands. 3 hours. She needed to hold Veronica and her henchmen for 3 hours. But how? She was a housekeeper against a powerful, manipulative woman who had trained men at her disposal. It seemed an impossible battle to win. She went downstairs and found even more activity. More people had arrived. She recognized the fake doctor, accompanied by 2 sturdy orderlies. Veronica spoke with them in a low voice, gesturing, giving instructions. Mary Ann managed to get close enough to overhear part of the conversation. If she resists, you know what to do? I have the authorization signed by her son. No one will question it. It's just a routine transfer for a lady with cognitive issues who can no longer live alone. The doctor nodded, and the orderlies seemed bored, as if it was just another job. How many times had they done this before? How many elderly people had already been torn from their homes against their will, under false medical pretenses? Mary Ann returned to Mrs. Helen's side. The lady was now standing, looking at the garden through the window. Her hands touched the glass as if she wanted to pass through it and go to the rose bushes one last time. Mary Ann noticed she was saying something softly, almost a whisper. Forgive me, Anthony. Forgive me for not being strong enough to protect our home. Forgive me for letting them destroy everything we built together. That broke Mary Ann's heart. She approached and embraced Mrs. Helen from behind, resting her chin on her shoulder. It's not over yet, Mrs. Helen. There's still time. Mr. Richard is coming. He will fix everything. You just need to trust me and be strong just a little longer. But would 3 hours be enough? Would they be able to hold out until Richard arrived? Mary Ann looked at the clock on the wall. 1:15 in the afternoon. In 45 minutes, the ambulance would arrive. And then the real confrontation would begin. Veronica entered the living room with that fake smile Mary Ann hated so much. She carried a document folder and a golden pen. Mrs. Helen, dear, I need you to sign some papers. It's just a formality for the care home, standard protocol. Mrs. Helen looked at the papers with empty eyes, already without the strength to fight. She took the pen with a trembling hand. That's when Mary Ann intervened, placing herself between the two. She won't sign anything. Veronica looked at her with surprise that quickly turned into ill-disguised anger. Excuse me? Who do you think you are to interfere in family matters? I am someone who truly cares about Mrs. Helen, and I won't let you deceive her anymore. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The men who were packing things stopped and looked at the scene. The fake doctor approached. Veronica's expression hardened, all falsity vanishing from her face to give way to something cold and dangerous. You're fired. Get your things and leave this house now. I'm not going anywhere, and Mrs. Helen isn't either. Veronica took a threatening step towards Mary Ann, but the young woman didn't back down. She stood firm, even with her heart pounding in her chest. Outside, the sound of a siren approached. The ambulance stopped in front of the mansion gate exactly at 2 in the afternoon. Veronica smiled with satisfaction, as if the sound of the siren was music to her ears. She turned to Mary Ann with a triumphant look. Your little act is over. Now get out of the way before I have these men remove you by force. Mary Ann felt terror tighten her throat, but she held firm. She needed to buy time. Every minute she could delay was one more minute for Richard to arrive. She glanced discreetly at the clock. 5:02. He had said 3 hours. That meant he would arrive around 3:30, perhaps a little earlier, if he could get a fast car at the airport. She needed to hold the situation for at least an hour and a half. "Mrs. Helen, I need you to listen carefully. Mr. Richard knows everything. He's coming here now. Don't sign anything. Don't get into that ambulance. Please, trust me." The lady looked at Mary Ann with confused eyes, then at Veronica, then at the men who were approaching. She was clearly terrified, not knowing whom to believe. Veronica seized on the hesitation. "Mrs. Helen, don't listen to this housekeeper. She's trying to confuse you. Richard gave me full authorization to take care of everything. Look, here's his signature on the documents. Everything is regularized. You're going to a wonderful place where you'll receive the best care. It's for your own good." Mary Ann saw Mrs. Helen starting to give in. The manipulation had been so effective, so prolonged, that the lady truly believed she was a burden, that she needed to leave that house. She was about to accept her fate when Mary Ann made a desperate decision. "Then show me the documents. I want to see this authorization signed by Mr. Richard." Veronica hesitated for a fraction of a second, but quickly composed herself. "You have no authority to demand anything. Get out of the way now or you'll regret it." It was then that Mary Ann pulled out her phone from her pocket and held it up for everyone to see. "I have recordings here of all your conversations. I know about the fake doctor, the forged reports, the falsified signatures. I know you plan to steal Mrs. Helen's shares and money. I have proof of everything." The silence that followed was deafening. Veronica turned pale, her eyes wide. The fake doctor took a step back. Even the orderlies looked uncomfortable. It was Veronica who broke the silence, but her voice had lost all false sweetness. Now it was pure venom. "You're bluffing. You have nothing." "I have everything. Want to hear it? I can play it now. Your phone conversations, your plans with the lawyer, everything you said about ripping out the rose bushes, about getting rid of Mrs. Helen, about taking control of her assets. Everything recorded with date and time. And you know what's even better? I've already sent copies to Mr. Richard's email. He has all the proof." Veronica lunged at Mary Ann with uncontrolled fury. "Give me that phone now!" Mary Ann recoiled, protecting the device against her chest. The orderlies approached, but she shouted with all the strength she could muster. "If anyone lays a finger on me, I'll scream so loud that all the neighbors will hear, and they'll call the police. Do you really want to risk being arrested for this?" The men hesitated. They looked at Veronica, awaiting instructions. She was visibly distraught, the careful plan she had laid out crumbling before her eyes. She tried to regain control, returning to the sweet tone she used to manipulate. "Mary Ann, dear, I think there's been a big misunderstanding. Perhaps you heard some things out of context and misinterpreted them. I only want the best for Mrs. Helen. We can talk about this calmly. There's nothing to talk about. Mrs. Helen is not leaving this house, not today, not ever, unless it's by her own will. And all of you are leaving now before I actually call the police." The fake doctor was the first to move. He muttered something about not being paid enough for this and walked out the door. The orderlies quickly followed him, clearly wanting distance from a situation that had become too complicated. Only Veronica, Mary Ann, Mrs. Helen, and the removal men remained, who seemed confused about what to do. Veronica tried one last card. "You don't know who you're messing with. I have lawyers, I have connections, I will destroy your life, your family, everything you love. When I'm done with you, you'll regret ever being born." Mary Ann felt fear run down her spine, but she didn't let it show on her face. "Do what you want, but Mrs. Helen stays here." It was at that moment that they heard the screech of tires outside, quick footsteps in the garden. The door burst open and Richard entered, utterly disheveled. His suit rumpled, his tie loose, his hair messy. His eyes swept across the scene, the scattered boxes, the strange men. Veronica with a furious expression on her face, Mary Ann protectively beside his mother. "What is going on here?" Veronica immediately recomposed her sweet mask and ran to him. "Darling, I'm so glad you're back. This housekeeper has gone mad. She's saying absurd things, preventing your mother from receiving the care she needs." Richard looked at Mary Ann, who simply raised her phone. "Mr. Richard, would you like to hear the recordings right here or privately?" He held out his hand. "Right here. I want everyone to hear." Mary Ann connected the phone to a speaker and started playing. The first recording was Veronica's phone conversation, planning how to get rid of the old woman, as she had called Mrs. Helen. Her voice echoed through the room, clear, unmistakable, saying horrible things about the lady who now looked at her with growing horror. Richard turned white. Veronica tried to interrupt, to say it was a fabrication, but he told her to be quiet. The second recording was the conversation with the lawyer about forging documents and signing fraudulent powers of attorney. The third was Veronica instructing the orderlies on how to sedate Mrs. Helen if she resisted. Each recording was like a bomb exploding. Richard grew increasingly pale, his fists clenched, his jaw locked. When Mary Ann played the recording where Veronica said she would rip out the rose bushes Anthony had planted, Mrs. Helen let out a moan of pain. Those flowers were the last living connection to the husband she had loved so much. The last recording was the most devastating. It was of the fake consultation with the doctor, clearly showing how the questions were formulated to confuse, how the diagnosis was forged. The voice of the false doctor declaring that Mrs. Helen had severe cognitive deterioration, followed by Veronica's voice congratulating him on a job well done. When silence returned, Richard was trembling. He turned slowly to Veronica, and the expression on his face was that of someone who had just woken from a nightmare to discover that reality was far worse. "Who are you? Who are you, really?" Veronica tried one last time to salvage the situation, but her voice came out trembling, desperate. "Richard, let me explain. It's not what it looks like. I only wanted to help. Your mother really needs care and you're always traveling." He took a step back as if her presence contaminated him. "You planned to steal my mother. Not just her money, not just her house. You were going to steal her dignity, her autonomy, her life. You were going to lock her in a care home against her will, while forging documents to steal everything that belongs to her. And you still had the audacity to do all this in my name, using my trust, my love." Tears began to stream down Veronica's face, but now they seemed tears of anger and frustration, not remorse. "Do you think I did all this just out of malice? Your mother is old, outdated, living in the past. This house is a waste in her hands. I could have transformed all of this into something really valuable, and you loved me, Richard. You would have given me everything willingly if I had just waited a little longer." The disgust on Richard's face was palpable. "I never loved you. I loved the person you pretended to be. The real woman standing in front of me now is a monster I don't even recognize. Get out of my house now." Veronica looked around, saw that there was nothing more she could do or say. The removal men had already discreetly left. She was completely alone, exposed, defeated. She picked up her bag with trembling hands and walked to the door. Before leaving, she turned one last time. "You will regret this, all of you." But the threat sounded hollow. It was just the last gasp of someone who had lost everything. The door closed behind her with a final sound. Heavy silence filled the room. Richard stood in the middle of the room looking at his mother as if seeing her for the first time in months. The silence that followed Veronica's departure was dense, laden with emotions no one knew how to express. Richard looked at his mother with eyes full of contained tears. Mrs. Helen remained seated in her armchair, hugging the photograph of her late husband to her chest, as if that image was the only anchor preventing her from completely collapsing. It was Richard who broke the silence. He knelt before his mother and held her hands gently, as if she were made of porcelain and could break at any moment. "Mother, forgive me. Please, forgive me for being so blind, so stupid. I should have noticed. I should have listened to you. I should have paid attention. I let that woman enter our lives and almost destroy everything. I almost lost you because of my negligence." Mrs. Helen raised one of her hands and touched her son's face. Her fingers trembled, but the gesture was full of tenderness. "You didn't know, my son. She was very good at pretending. She deceived all of us. Well, almost all of us." Her eyes turned to Mary Ann, who was leaning against the wall, still trembling from the adrenaline of everything that had happened. Richard followed his mother's gaze and stood up. He walked to Mary Ann and, to her surprise, hugged her tightly. "You saved my mother. You saved my entire family. I have no words to thank you for what you did. The courage you had, the loyalty, the love. You are much more than an employee of this house, Mary Ann. You are family, and from today on, I want you to be treated as such." The tears Mary Ann had held back throughout that confrontation finally streamed down. She cried on Richard's shoulder, releasing all the tension, all the fear, all the anguish she had carried in recent weeks. When they finally separated, Mrs. Helen was also crying, but they were tears of relief and gratitude. That night, none of the three could sleep. They stayed up late in the living room talking, processing everything that had happened. Richard asked to listen to all the recordings again, this time calmly, understanding the full extent of the macabre plan Veronica had orchestrated. With each revelation, his face grew more serious. When he heard about the rose bushes, about the plan to transform the garden into a modern deck, he saw the pain in his mother's eyes and felt guilt tighten his chest even more. In the following days, Richard cancelled all his trips and meetings. He decided he would spend time at home, reconnecting with the mother he had neglected for so long. They talked about Anthony, about happy memories, about the loneliness Mrs. Helen had faced since becoming a widow. He discovered things about his own mother that he had never noticed. Her strength, her wisdom, her capacity to love unconditionally even when she was being systematically destroyed. Mary Ann returned to her routine, but everything had changed. She was no longer treated as an employee. She had lunch and dinner with Mrs. Helen and Richard at the main table, participated in household decisions, was consulted about everything. The lady insisted on calling her "my dear," and this time the title carried an even greater weight, an official recognition that blood ties were not the only ones that defined a family. One afternoon, as they walked together in the garden, Mrs. Helen stopped before the rose bushes and remained silent for a long time. Mary Ann respected that moment, knowing that the lady was mentally conversing with Anthony, telling him about everything that had happened. "You know, Mary Ann, when Veronica threatened to rip out these roses, I felt she was threatening to erase the last proof that Anthony existed. These flowers are much more than plants. They are living memory. They are proof that the love we lived was real and continues to bloom even after he is gone." Mary Ann embraced the lady from behind, resting her chin on her shoulder, as she always did when she wanted to convey comfort. "And they will always continue to bloom, Mrs. Helen. No one will threaten that again. Never again." Richard watched the two from afar and felt something stir in his chest. He had spent so much time focused on business, on numbers, on corporate growth, that he had forgotten what truly mattered. Looking at those two women, his elderly mother and the young woman who had saved her, made him realize how empty all that professional success had been when his personal life was crumbling without him noticing. It was that night that the idea emerged. The three of them were having dinner when Richard placed his cutlery on the table and looked at his mother with a serious expression. "Mother, I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened, about how vulnerable you became, about how we almost lost you. And I started to wonder how many other elderly people are going through similar situations. How many are being manipulated, isolated, robbed by people who should be caring for them." Mrs. Helen nodded, her eyes revealing that she had also thought about it. "There are many, my son. Many indeed. Loneliness in old age is a silent epidemic. People grow old, children get too busy with their own lives, and the elderly are forgotten, treated as burdens. And then people like Veronica appear, who see in this vulnerability an opportunity to take advantage. Then I think we need to do something that transforms this horrible experience into something positive, something that helps other people not to go through what you went through." It was Mary Ann who asked, though she already imagined the answer. "What are you thinking, sir?" Richard took a deep breath, as if he was about to make one of the most important decisions of his life. "I want to create a community center for the elderly, a place where seniors can have companionship, activities, support, where they are not treated as burdens, but as the treasures of experience and wisdom that they truly are. I have the resources, I have the contacts, I can make this happen, but I need both of you to help me build something truly special." Mrs. Helen and Mary Ann looked at each other, surprised and moved. It was exactly the kind of project that would give meaning to all the suffering they had faced. It would transform pain into hope, trauma into purpose. In the following weeks, the project quickly took shape. Richard bought a spacious plot of land on the outskirts of Bath, a place with mountain views, with enough space for gardens, activity rooms, a library, a community kitchen. He hired architects to design a welcoming, comfortable space that wouldn't feel institutional but rather an extension of a home. Mrs. Helen became completely involved in the planning. Suddenly, she had a purpose again. She was no longer the lonely lady waiting for the days to pass. She was someone who could use her experience to help others. She suggested activities, thought about the decor, chose the colors of the walls. She wanted everything to convey warmth, welcome, dignity. Mary Ann was appointed deputy director of the project. She would be responsible for coordinating daily activities, contacting families, and selecting volunteers. It was an enormous responsibility, but she accepted it with the characteristic determination of someone who had faced a monster and won. The construction took 6 months. Throughout this time, the relationship between the three deepened even further. Richard learned to balance work and family. He was present, participated, listened. He discovered that his mother had much more to offer than he had ever imagined. Every story she told about her life was a lesson. Every piece of advice was pure gold. Mary Ann finally managed to bring her sick mother to Bath. She found a small house near the mansion and appropriate treatments. Her siblings also came, studying in good schools that Richard helped secure. The family she had left in the Scottish Highlands was now reunited, living with dignity, with a future. When the Anthony Alastair Community Centre was inaugurated, hundreds of people attended. Mrs. Helen had insisted that the centre bear her late husband's name, saying he would be proud to see his name associated with something so beautiful. The space was truly special. Flower gardens, including an entire bed of rose bushes that Mrs. Helen had personally planted, spacious and bright rooms, a library with books donated by the community, a kitchen where seniors could cook together and revive family recipes. On the day of the inauguration, Mrs. Helen gave an emotional speech. She spoke about loneliness, about dignity, about how no one should be discarded simply for having grown old. She spoke about Mary Ann, about the courage of a young woman who risked everything to do what was right. She spoke about Richard, about how her son had transformed pain into purpose. And she spoke about Anthony, about how that centre was a continuation of the love they had shared, a love that now multiplied and reached dozens, hundreds of people. The first seniors began attending the centre the following week. They were people rejected by families, lonely, some with financial resources, others with nothing. It didn't matter. All were received with the same warmth, the same respect, the same dignity. Mrs. Helen was there every day, chatting, listening to stories, offering comfort. Mary Ann coordinated the activities, the communal lunches, the craft workshops, the reading groups. Richard appeared regularly, bringing not only resources but also his presence, proving that caring for the elderly was not just a task for women or professionals, but for all of society. 5 years had passed since that terrible day when Veronica almost managed to destroy everything. The Anthony Alastair Community Centre had transformed into much more than a simple gathering place. It was a movement, a benchmark, a symbol of hope for seniors throughout Scotland. The success of the first centre led to the opening of 3 more units, one in Glasgow, another in Keswick, and the most recent in a deprived community in East London. Each maintained the same principles: dignity, respect, unconditional welcome. It didn't matter if the person had money or not, if they had family or were alone, if they were healthy or needed special care. All were welcome. Mrs. Helen had completely transformed. At 78, she was more vibrant than ever. Her agenda was full of commitments, lectures, meetings with authorities to discuss public policies for the elderly. She had become an important voice in defending the rights of seniors, using her own experience as an example of what should not happen to anyone. Mary Ann, now 27, had grown enormously. She was no longer that shy young woman from the countryside who had arrived at the mansion with an old suitcase and small dreams. She was a respected professional, general coordinator of all the centres, responsible for a team of over 50 employees and hundreds of volunteers. She had completed the social work course that Richard had insisted on paying for and used the acquired knowledge to constantly improve the programs offered. Richard had also changed. He remained a successful businessman, but now his priorities were different. He drastically reduced his travels, delegated more responsibilities, and dedicated at least half of his time to the social project that had become his true passion. He even wrote a book about the experience, telling the story of how he almost lost his mother and how that led him to create something greater than himself. The center's 5th anniversary would be celebrated with a grand event. They had rented a huge space at the original headquarters, set up tents in the gardens, and prepared a banquet. Hundreds of people were invited: seniors who attended the centers, their families, volunteers, authorities, businessmen who supported the project, and the press who had followed the growth of that initiative over the years. On the morning of the celebration, Mrs. Helen woke up early. She went to the mansion garden, where the rose bushes planted by Anthony continued to bloom magnificently. She knelt before the flowers and spoke softly, as she always did when she needed guidance or simply wanted to share something important. "Today is a special day, my love. 5 years since I almost lost everything. But look what emerged from that darkness. Look how many lives have been touched, how many people found hope where there was only loneliness. You would be so proud, and you know what's most beautiful? Our family has grown. Richard found his purpose, and Mary Ann, that girl who arrived here with nothing, became the daughter we never had. The family that blood didn't give us, our heart chose." Richard watched his mother from the window, seeing her talk to the flowers. He smiled. He had learned that those conversations were not a sign of dementia or confusion, as Veronica had tried to make it seem. They were simply his mother's way of keeping a lifetime's love alive. And there was beauty in that, not illness. Mary Ann came downstairs already dressed for the celebration. She wore an elegant blue dress that Mrs. Helen had insisted on buying for her. Her hair was styled in a sophisticated bun, quite different from the simple braid she used to wear when she first arrived at the mansion. But her eyes remained the same, brown, kind, full of determination. The three had breakfast together, as they did every morning. It was a sacred ritual that no one dared to break. They talked about the event, about the speeches each would give, about the surprises they had prepared. There was a special energy in the air, a mixture of joy and gratitude. The event began at 2 in the afternoon. The center's gardens were crowded. Seniors from all units had been brought in special vans. Many were accompanied by family members who had reconnected with their loved ones thanks to the center's work. There was live music, abundant tables of food, colorful decoration that was anything but institutional, conveying warmth and celebration instead. The speeches began at 4 o'clock. The first was by an 85-year-old lady named Beatrice, who had attended the center since day one. Her story was one of the most touching. She had been abandoned by her family in a substandard care home where she was treated as a number, not a person. When she learned about the Anthony Allister Center, she escaped the home and appeared at the door asking for shelter. Mrs. Helen received her personally, listened to her story, and since then Beatrice had become one of the most assiduous attendees. "I was ready to give up on life. I thought no one cared if I existed anymore, but here in this blessed place I found not only a reason to continue, but also a new family. I learned that growing old is not the end of the story, it's just a new chapter. And this chapter can be as beautiful as the previous ones, as long as there is love, respect, and dignity." Tears streamed down the faces of many present. Other people took to the stage to share their stories. A 90-year-old gentleman who had learned to paint at the center and now sold his canvases in galleries. A 75-year-old lady who had found new love at one of the monthly dances, promoted there. An 80-year-old man who, after years isolated at home, had discovered the joy of teaching chess to the children of the neighboring community. Each story was a testament to the transformative power of that project, but everyone agreed that none of this would exist without the courage of a young housekeeper who had risked everything to do what was right. When it was Mary Ann's turn to speak, she stepped onto the stage, trembling. Not from fear, but from the emotion of seeing so many lives that had been touched. She looked at the crowd and took a deep breath before beginning. 5 years ago, I was just a young woman from the countryside who came to the big city in search of work. I didn't imagine I would find much more than a job. I found a family, I found a purpose, and I found the courage I didn't even know I had within me. When I saw Mrs. Helen being slowly destroyed by someone who only wanted to take advantage of her, I knew I had to act. Not because it was my job, but because it was the right thing to do. Because she didn't deserve that. Because no one deserves to be treated as disposable just for having grown old. She paused, tears beginning to stream. This center exists because Mrs. Helen and Mr. Richard transformed pain into purpose. But it also exists because all of us believe that every life has value regardless of age, that every person deserves dignity, respect, love, and that family is not just those who share our blood, but those who choose to stand by us in the most difficult moments. The applause was deafening. Mrs. Helen went up to the stage and hugged Mary Ann tightly. Richard joined. Them and the three stood there embracing while hundreds of people celebrated not just an anniversary, but the victory of love over malice, of courage over fear, of hope over despair. When the applause finally ceased, Mrs. Helen took the microphone. Her voice was firm, full of emotion, but also of strength. My dears, 5 years ago I was on the verge of losing everything. My home, my autonomy, my dignity. A wicked person almost managed to destroy not only my material possessions, but my very identity. But 3 things saved me. Mary Ann's courage, my son Richard's love, and the certainty that as long as there are good people in the world, there is hope. She pointed to the gardens around. Do you see these roses? They were almost torn out. Someone wanted to destroy them because they represented the past, because they occupied space that could be used for something more modern, more lucrative. But these flowers are not just plants. They are memory. They are love. They are proof that beautiful things can continue to bloom even after difficult times. She wiped away her tears before continuing. And today I want to make 3 important announcements. First, Mary Ann, you who arrived as an employee and became my savior, my confidant, my daughter of the heart. I want to formalize what everyone already knows. You are my daughter, not on paper because that doesn't matter, but in every sense that truly counts. And I want everyone to know that. The audience erupted in applause. Mary Ann cried openly, embraced by Mrs. Helen. Richard also had tears in his eyes, happy to see his mother finally officially recognizing the bond that had always existed. The second announcement, my son Richard has decided to build a complete senior living complex with assisted residences, a medical center, leisure spaces, all designed so that seniors can live with autonomy and dignity. It will be the largest project of its kind in Scotland. And this complex will bear the name of someone very special. She paused dramatically, looking directly at Mary Ann. It will be called the Mary Ann Smith Complex, in honor of the woman who proved that an ordinary person can do extraordinary things when acting with courage and love. Mary Ann covered her face with her hands, completely overcome by emotion. Never, not even in her wildest dreams, had she imagined that one day her name would be associated with something so grand, so important. The poor girl from the Scottish Highlands, who arrived in the city with an old suitcase and few dreams, would now be immortalized in a complex that would help thousands of people. And the third announcement, I have created a foundation that will ensure this work continues for generations. I have allocated a significant portion of my assets so that the centers never close, so that there are always resources to welcome those in need. Because this cannot just be one family's initiative. It needs to be a legacy for all of society. The celebration continued until nightfall. There was music, dancing, shared stories, laughter, and tears. As the sun began to set, painting the sky orange and pink, Mrs. Helen, Richard, and Mary Ann moved away from the crowd and went to the rosebed that had been planted in the center's gardens. They stood there, the 3 of them together, looking at the flowers that swayed gently in the afternoon breeze. It was a moment of reflection, of gratitude, of recognition of how far they had come. You know, Mrs. Helen began. When Veronica threatened to rip out Anthony's roses, I thought it would be the end of everything. But now I realize it was just the beginning. Those roses continue to bloom at the mansion, and these here bloomed because of what we lived through. We multiplied love, hope, and that is far more powerful than any malice. Richard embraced his mother on one side and Mary Ann on the other. I've learned that family isn't just who you're born with. It's who chooses to stay, who fights for us, who transforms our worst moments into opportunities for growth. You, too, taught me that. And you've taught hundreds of people who pass through our centers that it's never too late to start over, to find purpose, to be happy. Mary Ann looked at the darkening sky, saw the first stars begin to appear. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I hadn't had the courage to act that day, if I had been afraid, if I had stayed silent. Mrs. Helen wouldn't be here. This center wouldn't exist. All these people wouldn't have found hope, and I wouldn't have found my true family. The courage of one moment changed everything. The three remained there until night fell completely. In the distance, they could still hear the music of the celebration, the laughter of the seniors who had found joy where before there had only been loneliness. And when they finally returned to join the party, they did so with hearts full of gratitude and with the certainty that they had built something that transcended their own lives. That night, as the celebration came to an end and people began to leave, an elderly lady approached Mary Ann. She had tears in her eyes and held the young woman's hand tightly. "Thank you for existing. Thank you for being courageous when no one else would be. Because of you, my grandmother found this place and started smiling again. Because of you, many families like mine learned that the elderly are not burdens, but treasures. You change the world, even if it's a small world, but for us it's everything." Mary Ann hugged the lady, feeling the weight of those words. That was it. In the end, it wasn't about grand gestures or public recognition. It was about individual lives being touched, about people finding hope, about families being rebuilt. When the last person left and the center fell silent, Richard, Mrs. Helen, and Mary Ann took a final walk through the gardens. The soft lights illuminated the paths. The rose bushes looked almost magical under the moonlight. "It was here that everything began," said Mrs. Helen, "with flowers planted out of love. And look what it has transformed into, entire gardens of hope blooming everywhere." Richard smiled. "And we will continue planting, because now we understand that this is our purpose, not just to accumulate wealth or build businesses, but to cultivate dignity, respect, love." Mary Ann looked at the two, at the family that destiny had given her, and knew she was finally home. Not in the physical house where she worked, but in the home that the heart builds when it finds people who truly love. And on that serene Bath night, under the starry sky and surrounded by the roses that refused to die, the three recognized the deepest truth of all. True family is formed by love, gratitude, and the courage to protect those who cannot defend themselves. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Mary Ann, Mrs. Helen, and Richard has touched your hearts deeply. This journey reminds us that courage can bloom in the most unexpected places, and that true love transcends any blood tie. If this narrative moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the bell to not miss any of the stories we bring daily. Leave a like if you believe in the power of kindness and loyalty, and tell us in the comments what moment touched you most in this story. We have prepared a special playlist with other equally captivating narratives that explore family bonds, overcoming adversity, and unconditional love. Find them by clicking here beside. Every day we bring unique stories that celebrate the complexity and beauty of life. Share this story with someone who needs to believe that there is always hope, even in the darkest moments. See you in the comments and in the next story. Until next time.